Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Camila Escalante. She's a presenter for Telesur. Camila, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
It's a great pleasure having you on. Want to talk about a couple of different things in the hemisphere that you guys cover on Telesur with a really important perspective. First, there were elections recently in Dominica. Prime Minister Scarrett was able to win re-election in a center-left platform. There was talk before from the opposition of the OAS calling these elections into question, which of course is becoming a really dangerous theme hemispherically. But before we kind of get to that, what just happened in Dominica and what were the stakes of that election?
Okay, so what we saw in Dominica is actually the turnout for the election was that the governing Dominica Labor Party overwhelmingly won the seats that were available. There were 21 seats up for grab, and they won 18 of those seats. But what we saw was a massive red flag along the way, which was the opposition and its national media within Dominica teaming up with international media and the OAS to fabricate these scenes of repression from the ground up in order to show citizens protesting against tyranny, and then also these claims of possible fraud in the election. And like all of that kind of made it seem like this election could have gone both ways, that there was so much opposition to the government. So this government has now been sworn in, or Roosevelt Scarrett, the prime minister, has been sworn in for his fourth term. But the Dominica Labor Party is now on its fifth term. And so the U.S. was really, and the OAS were, really itching to get them out. And but they really made it seem like the situation where over time the government is actually losing support. And that's simply not the case. So, yeah, the opposition tried to make a case in the way that we saw, in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and in Venezuela, that it's time for a new government, that in order to cling on to power, they were going to do everything, the government and the electoral authorities would do everything possible to rig these elections. And of course, the outcome is just unbelievably undisputable. All of the sort of roadblocks and violence and the media antics actually worked against them.
What is the record of Roosevelt Scarrett? I mean, I've looked more into what's happening in Dominica, and what's striking to me, and this is just like, I mean, regardless of where this type of interference is happening, obviously Venezuela, Bolivia is unacceptable, but you're not talking about like a particularly radical government at all in Dominica. What is it what does their record look like in power, and what kind of even narrow steps do you have to take to become potentially a target of interference from the U.S. and the OAS?
Right. Well, they do. The government and Roosevelt Scarrett have promoted some social programs that are arguably much more leftist than what we would see from the opposition. Mm-hmm. But, Scarrett did a number of things in this tiny country of about 75,000 people to get on the bad side of Washington. And it does tie back to Venezuela. The CARICOM, the Caribbean community, played an indispensable, principled peacekeeping role in the region since January of this year, when we saw the United States and the Venezuelan opposition attempt to install Juan Guaido in Venezuela. And so more mainstream media focus on the roles of Uruguay and Mexico and even Norway for facilitating talks. But CARICOM and the countries that make up CARICOM, which is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and even Trinidad and Tobago and St. Lucia, very vocally called for dialogue and made calls for non-interference, saying that the Caribbean has to remain a zone of peace. You might have seen these, at the United Nations General Assembly, we saw Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley making this plea as well. And so Venezuela is a Caribbean country and a close neighbor, a next door neighbor of Trinidad and Tobago. And, between January and April in particular, we thought that there would be a high possibility of U.S. military intervention around Venezuela. And those provocations were not just coming from from the U.S. main base in Colombia, where the Colombian government is just an extension of the U.S., but the provocation was being staged in the Caribbean Sea. So some of these governments are not even firmly behind President Nicolas Maduro per se all of the time, but they recognize the need to defend their territory's sovereignty from being used for war staging. And of course, this is also a government, the government of Roosevelt Scared is also a member of the ALBA TCP bloc. And I think it would be, kind of silly to assume that the United States wants some sort of specific natural resource within all of these Caribbean states. I think Washington is actually just fighting to maintain its hegemony throughout the region. And there are, of course, other reasons to invade Latin American countries besides just lithium and gas. So what they're trying to do here is dismantle the bloc of small countries, which has put themselves at massive risk. This is a massive risk they're taking by standing up and siding with Venezuela in some cases and publicly opposing the unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. And by them doing that, by Roosevelt Scarrett doing that in the UN through CARICOM, it is creating some semblance of balance of power in the region.
Yeah, we played Mia Motley on this show, and actually we have a good friend and Dave from Jamaica who calls from Jamaica, and he rightly was like, hey, I mean, that was great, but what does that mean when a prime minister or leader from a Caribbean nation state so aggressively, even rhetorically, rejects, U.S. imperial posturing, as, she did, obviously, with the U.S. interference and attempt to dislodge the Maduro government. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of contextualizing Dominica. Now,
absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
And let me see, he's not, he's Roosevelt Scared is not the only one. The most explicit, some people say the most socialist person of another small Caribbean island state is the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves. And he's also spoke very openly, very explicitly against U.S. sanctions. And, he's very openly anti-imperialist and a friend of Venezuela and Cuba. I just saw him at the beginning of November in Cuba and Havana at this international, solidarity conference with Cuba. And he's a very principled man. And what he said is that the United States is doing in Venezuela should be investigated as a possible war crime. And he says that Venezuela is being targeted for ideological reasons, not for any sort of democracy or freedom or peace. The United States is inciting war in plain sight. And, all throughout the world, the media is skewing this reality. And so what St. Vincent did is they actually ran for a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And so the UN Security Council, so that was in June, they actually won that seat, which was pretty major for the Caribbean, and it was celebrated there. And of course, Washington was pushing a seat for Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who's the new right-wing president. But this year, the United States tried to take Venezuela to the UN Security Council to try to take action. And of course, permanent members China and Russia actually blocked that. But this is allowing St. Vincent to take a seat is actually giving more voice to, some of these smaller states. But actually, it's what it translates to is giving more voice to the region. Because now, now a dissenting voice that goes against Washington is able to stand up against them in the international arena.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just always want to reiterate that really any separate track conversation that people want to have on the complexities of Venezuela and any objections people may have to this or that policy in Venezuelan, in the Venezuelan government is irrelevant in many respects, almost all respects, to this broader objection to U.S. regime change efforts, and also this bigger conversation about autonomy, sovereignty, and actual co-equal partnership in the Caribbean and Latin America with the United States, which is, of course, obviously never been the case. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.